Good morning. Everybody's all perky after losing an hour's sleep last night. There'll be some of them coming in about 10 o'clock saying, where's the class? It's not here. You know, I set mine at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon so I would know, remember to do it. So, for those of you that weren't here last week, this is normally Marty in his class, and Marty's still on his little vacation. He'll be back next Sunday, so you won't have to put up with me next Sunday unless you go into the fellowship hall, because that's where we'll continue our study on the Tabernacle. Marty, by the way, will be teaching on the kings, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So he's going to give you that's what his title is. Ours, of course, is the Tabernacle Biography. And I call it a biography because when I thought about biographies, you know, you think about either a person or a thing, maybe an event, but when you think about it, you think about all the things that combine into that biography, in that person's life. In other words, you can't just talk about a person without bringing in the influences in that person's life if you're going to do their biography. And same way with the tabernacle. For the most part, the tabernacle is taken for granted. Most denominations don't even consider it important. That was the Old Testament. We don't need to worry about that. They will usually acknowledge, though, that it meant a lot to the 12 tribes of Israel. They were very much involved in the tabernacle. In fact, that was their central point. So we will examine the tabernacle. There it is. That's one picture of it. You'll have half a dozen pictures because nobody had a Polaroid then, so we're having to go from artist conceptions. But we'll examine the life history, if you would, of the tabernacle and its relation to the Hebrews and to us today, because it connects with Christ all the way through. And as we go, we'll try to point out some of those areas. Some of the things we probably know about the Old Testament, we probably already know those, in fact. And it's our reference in history. But it's good sometimes to take the things out that we know and dust them off and remind us, make it a little bit stronger to us. And hopefully we'll learn something in this class about the Tabernacle's biography and history that'll be new to you. So with that in mind, we'll take off and take a look at some of our slides and talk about them this morning. Our reference, of course, in history, just like in any biography, you get the person, but you have something to go from, some type of an outline or something. In our outline, our reference is, of course, the Old Testament. The Old Testament that could consist, that's written on similar to a scroll this way that you see on that slide, written on a scroll similar to that one. There was 39 books altogether in the Old Testament. 17 of them were historical. 5 of them were poetical. 17 of them were prophetic. And the first 5 books are called the Pentateuch, or the Torah. The Pentateuch meaning 5, the first 5 books. Torah means law. So if you remember that, you'll remember the Pentateuch, 5 books. And that's what they used for the Mosaical law. That's where they gathered all the things that they were to do in those years before Jesus came. And let's see, we're reminded that we're not under the Old Testament rules. And that's true. We're under a new covenant. After all, the New Testament is a new will. The Old Testament was the old will, if you would. And since we don't live under the law, some of you might say, well, why waste the time? Why worry about it? Since we're not under the Old Testament rules, it's irrelevant. It's boring. It's difficult to read. The New Testament's a whole lot less confusing. It's simpler. It's easier to read. It's easier for us to understand than all the rituals and things that went on in the Old Testament. So we tend to skim over the details and often the tedious texts that are in the Old Testament. With careful examination, though, we can uncover some scriptural treasures as we go along. by studying it. It's a very, very interesting section of our Bibles. And it's the foundation that Christ built upon and in Christianity that you and I observe today. It's filled with many shadows of things to come. We'll talk about those in the progressing lessons. They got the shadows. We have symbolism that's there, and we also have types and antitypes. And when we get to those, we'll talk about them a little more, because I have a hard time sometimes keeping them confused which one's which. Is this the antitype or is this the type? And I have a little trick that I've learned that I'm going to give to you when we get to that point. And I got the cotton mouth again, so if it sounds kind of funny, it's because my tongue is sticking to the roof of my mouth. So bear with me, all right? The new law speaks of the old law many, many times. It's a shadow of things to come. Corinthians 2:17 says that which are shadows of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Hebrews 8:5 says that who serves as a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. Oh, there's that word in the New Testament, huh? Hebrews 10:1. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never, with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually by year, make those who are perfect, or who approach rather, perfect. So it talks about the tabernacle, about priestly services. It talks about it being a shadow of things to come. It reflects the true tabernacle, which is in heaven and where God dwells now. But he also sends his Spirit to dwell in us, which is kind of makes us sort of a tabernacle in a sense. John 1:45 says, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses is in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So he said, we know about this guy. They've been talking about him for centuries in the Old Testament, and here he is. He's here. And he was all thrilled and excited because he had looked at what we call the Old Testament in the law, and he knew it. Paul called it a tutor, a teacher, if you would, instructor. It's there to help us get it, so to speak, oh, bless your heart. I can certainly use that, yes. It's amazing how much your tongue works better when it don't stick to your roof of your mouth. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, man. Paul called it a tutor in the Old Testament laws because they were preparing us for the coming of Christ. Remember in Galatians it says when the time was right, that God sent his son. So we were ready for it, would be ready for it, because we've had a chance to look at what's happened in the past. We're much more blessed than what those Hebrews were. Even though God was right there with them, with presence they could see, they didn't have all the evidence that we have. And you can almost understand some of their disbelief at times, but not ours. Not if we look at what all we have as a record. We should never have any problems and doubt. Galatians 3:24-25, therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under that law. So we're not under the Old Testament law, but it certainly is a big help for us under the New Testament law. Do you think that God put anything in the Bible that was irrelevant? That was a question that you have to ask if you're thinking about the Old Testament. When people say, well, that's the old law, it didn't make any difference. Well, I guess God just threw it out there for no reason. And that's not the case. Every scripture is given for instruction, reproof, to make us better, to be a better servant, to be a better Christian. God placed every jot and tittle. You remember that? He's talked about the jots and the tittles. That's the little markings in the Hebrews, just little tiny dots change the word to a whole different word if you didn't put that in there. And he said, every jot and tittle was there for a reason. God intended on us knowing. When he wanted it emphasized, he dwells upon it. He repeats it. He goes over and over it. And how many times do we talk about it in the Old Testament, about the tabernacle? You know, that kind of fills that whole section of the scriptures on and off. And I'll talk about how often it comes up here. Just saying, well, think about it. Here it is. There. 2 relatively short chapters explain the creation. Just 2 chapters, Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Out of all the vastness of the universe, out of the planet system we have, and the stars and the moon and the gravitational pull and the orbits, all those things God set up in 2 chapters. But there are 50 chapters to explain the construction of the tabernacle, its features, its furniture, its the services that's involved in it. 50 different times it's mentioned in the Old Testament. Creation, 2 chapters. So it must really be important to God, I would think, if he's going to mention it that much. It would be. So he emphasizes it through repetition. The tabernacle's mentioned, again, here's some more information on that. 13 times in Exodus, 18 times in Numbers, 13 times in Numbers, 18 times in Leviticus, 2 times in Hebrews, 4 times. So that's a lot of times, and in a lot of different books and a lot of different writers. So it must be really important to God. It was called the tabernacle. It was called the tabernacle of testimony, the tabernacle of a congregation, the tent of testimony, the tent of witness, the tent of the congregation. All those things were the tabernacle. Regardless of what it was termed, that's the times that we see it. The Old Testament dealt with it unequivocally. Okay, must have been important to God. I think we said that. Old Testament deals unquestionable authority of God. The rules weren't meant to burden the Israelites. They thought so, but it wasn't meant for that. The tabernacle rules and how to worship and how to conduct their lives weren't meant as a burden. They were showing the approach to God on his terms and none other. We can learn our first lesson there. There's only one way to approach God, and it's through Jesus Christ. I'm the door. I'm the way. Only one way, and God, it's the only way he'll accept it. The only way he accepted it from the Israelites was to do it under his terms. You went through the gate, you sacrificed, but you didn't get any closer to God. That's as far as you could go. Then he had emissaries that were there, the priests that could take your religion a little bit further to the tabernacle, into the holy place. And then only once a year could they go up right almost face to face to God within his presence. And even then, they tried to fill the room up with so much smoke that they couldn't see him or he couldn't see them. Hopefully they wouldn't see him, because they knew if they saw the face of God, they were going to die. We, on the other hand, can get on our knees. Don't even have to be on our knees at any time. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 65 days? 60, this year, because of the leap year? Or is it 66 days? I'm not sure. But we could get on our knees and talk to God any time, day or night. He's always there. He's always awake. He doesn't lose any hours over his daylight saving time. He's there for us at any time. How much better off are we? I mean, it's just amazing to me. This reminds me of that so much as we go through our study. God's absolute authority was required obedience. Has that changed? That's why the scripture said he's a God, same God he was in the Old Testament, he is in the New Testament. He hasn't changed. He still requires obedience. If you want salvation, you're going to have to be obedient. It's not a work, it's a joy. We should be happy that we can be. Because what happened? excuse me, I've missed this point almost. It reveals the sin. That's what the old law did. That's why they were at the tabernacle. Every time they walked through the gate, they were reminded, guess what? Why am I here? I'm here because I've sinned. I'm here to give an offer to God as a sacrifice. Hopefully, this will change things and God will forgive me. This is what their hope was. They laid it into the priest's hand and let him take over. What was the consequence of not obedience? If you strayed from the commandments, what happened? They died. If we stray from the commandments, eventually we're going to be called before God. And if we haven't been obedient, guess what's going to happen to us? We're going to die. Not physically, but eternally. And that's kind of frightening. But the reminder again is in the Old Testament. If they were obedient, God was there. If they got disobedient, God punished them. And some of the punishments, if you read them, were very, very severe. He opened the ground up, swallowed up thousands of Israelites at Mount Sinai. That's just one example. So let's begin with, now that we've kind of given our little introductory aspect of it, we'll begin with a quick review in the Tabernacle's biography. Colossians 2:17, we mentioned a while ago, it's only the shadow of things to come in the Old Testament. I want to make sure I get these back in order. This will quickly deteriorate if we don't have them in the right spot. There it is. These are only a shadow of what is to come, but the substance, the reality, if you would, belongs to Christ. God and Moses, everybody knows that's Moses. That's the only picture we have of Moses, I don't think. I think it's probably now in every Bible that you would buy. Poor old Charlton Heston's always going to be Moses to me. He was head of the NRA, and it's still, I keep waiting for him to say, I'm going to part the waters. But God and Moses was chosen to lead the nation after 10 generations of being slaves to Egypt. He received his first instructions, if you remember, was at the burning bush. The very first time he actually got instructions face to face, if you would, or voice to voice, was at that burning bush. God says, you go back to Egypt and let my people get out of there. And he goes, what? You got the wrong guy, don't you? I stutter. I have a hard time with cotton mouth, maybe. He said, but it's kind of, are you sure it's me you want? So his first instructions, he finally decided, maybe I better go. God's serious about this. He's got a bush that's here in front of me. It's not burning up. There's fire, but it's not burning up. So he said, okay, we'll go there and see what happens. Well, God performed many miracles in that process. Of course, the first miracle, Moses crossed the Red Sea after they got him out of there. Not counting all the plagues that went on before that, but God had instituted those and hardened Pharaoh's heart so that they could leave. And there's a lot of things that went on when they were leaving. They got wealth, we'll talk about in a little bit. The people were happy. They were finally getting out of 400 years of slavery. And then they look back behind them, and what's coming? The Egyptian army. Pharaoh's changed his mind. He's coming for them. Moses is trying to conduct between 2 and 3 million people. I think about 3 million people in the desert trying to escape Pharaoh's army. That would be like us trying to take the United States to Mexico and watching the Air Force coming after us. They didn't have a chance, and they knew that they didn't have a chance. And they're looking back, and God says, don't worry about it. Moses says, don't worry about it. You're not going to, God will take care of you. Well, God did. How am I doing here on time? I've got to make sure. There were other miracles that God performed for the Hebrews before the tabernacle got there, and after as well. He feeds the Hebrews from the heavens. Manna was there every morning. All they had to do was go out and pick it up. That's better than Walmart's delivery system. You got to go pick it up, but you got to drive up there and get it. All they had to do was step out the door. And there was their food for the day. You gathered enough for that day because anything that was left over, what happened to it? It got spoiled. It was terrible. You couldn't eat it. Except on the sixth day. There's another miracle. It doesn't rot on the sixth day. That was the Sabbath day. So you got enough on Friday to last you to Sunday, and it was fine. But any other day, it would deteriorate, evaporate, or whatever it might be, however that happened. Excuse me. So Moses would lead them for the next 40 years, which wasn't too bad for an old man. He was 80 years old at the time when they left Egypt. Lived to be 120. I think about 80 years old. That's only 7 years older than me, and that's when he started. I can't imagine walking hardly from here to the parking lot, much less 40 years in a desert. You know. But he did. He walked with them and stayed with them for 40 years. So we get to the point where he takes them to the Mount Sinai. He was called there God sent him there to receive the commandments and the construction of the tabernacle. And we're going to look at that closer in another lesson. Because like I said, this is kind of the beginning of our biography, the preface, if you want to use that. But he went and we all know the story about that he went up on the mountain, got his instructions, come back down, and he looks down. And again, I see Charlton Heston looking down on the children of Israel from the mountaintop and sees out there worshiping this golden calf, and he gets angry, and he breaks the tablets, throws them on the ground. And I've often thought about that, and I don't know if I would have, I'd have been awful angry to think I was actually testing the anger of God, because you think of him as a parent, say, you broke it? I just gave it to you, and you broke it already? That's what we do with our kids. I just gave this thing to you, brand spanking new, and you didn't even get down to the bottom of the hill, and you broke it already. So you had to go back up again and receive that information for the second time. And it takes him 40 days the first time, and it takes him 40 days the second time. And then he finally comes back down with it, and then, of course, he instigates the punishment for their disbelief and for their idolatry that they carried, and move on. The tabernacle blueprints. It's kind of interesting because where am I at here? I lost my place. Oh, there we are. This laid out the materials and of the tabernacle plus the construction. And they were specified by God in great detail to Moses. Why do you think that was? Why did he say, hey, Moses, pitch me a tent? That's what he actually is. The tabernacle physically was a tent. Hey, Moses, go make me a tent. He said, you make me a tent, but here's what I want it made like. I want so many skins on top of it to protect it. I want gold in certain spots. I want silver in certain spots. I want an altar of sacrifice. I want a laver for washing your hands. I want a table of showbread. I want a candlestick. I want the incense. I want a curtain. And here's how I want the curtains made. Any of you gentlemen that have moved knows when your wife says, I know what curtains I want. You best not put up a different set of curtains. Because if it's the wrong color or the wrong kind, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. God was the same way. He said, I'm going to take charge of this. Everything that I do is going to be perfect. God's going to micromanage, if you would, the tabernacle. Every last detail. Like all of his creation, if you think about it from Genesis 1 and 2, God micromanaged everything, didn't he? He put everything in there and said it was good. Well, the tabernacle was the same way. It was good. God knew the whole plan, and the tabernacle being set up as a shadow of things to come. I believe, God says to Moses They shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. You must make the tabernacle and all its furnishings following the plan that I am showing you. That's in Exodus 25, 8 through 10. Each part of the construction and the religious instruction had future connection with the redemption of mankind through that upcoming Messiah. That's why God was so particular about it. That's why he wanted it done the way it was done. God provided not just the construction material, but the wealth to build it. It was a lot of gold, a lot of silver, a lot of precious cloth and thread. All guess where it came from? It came from Egypt. The Egyptians furnished it for them. Thank you very much. Courtesy of the Egyptians, that's how they got the material in the middle of the desert to build this tabernacle for God. We see that in Exodus 3, 21 and 22, and it's repeated again in chapter 12. He told Israel, go collect, ask your neighbors for wealth, for their wealth. And the Egyptians were so glad after those plagues that they gave them whatever they wanted. How about your gold? Here, take it, please. What else you want? Anything, just get out of here. I don't want anything but for you to leave. Everything else doesn't matter. Just please leave. That was their attitude. And God looked at it as really kind of wages for the Egyptians, for their time, or not for the Egyptians, for the Hebrews, for their time in slavery. They didn't make a dime while they were in slavery, but guess what? When they left Egypt, they did. They took all the gold, all the wealth, all of the good stuff from Egypt when they left, and Egypt would never really rise to power again. Everything belongs to God to begin with, so he really wasn't taking anything away from anybody that he didn't already have. We talk about that every Sunday when we offer the contribution. This belongs to God to begin with. Well, it really does. He doesn't need our money. He didn't need their money. But he saw that what he wanted to do, to forecast, if you would, to shadow, to foretell what was coming in a physical manner, that's why he used the Egyptian and their money. So it's time to build the tabernacle. So we're ready now for it to take root here. And Moses, of course, is asked to bring the gold and the silver materials for its construction, plus the wood. Think about it, they didn't have anything. They didn't have any wood. They were in a desert. There's not a lot of wood out there except maybe a few tumbleweeds, which reminds me, the first day I ever came into Oklahoma when we moved down here. I was with a friend of mine. I was working for General Motors, going to go to work for him the next day. Came through the Fort Smith Junction, and a tumbleweed went across the road in front of me. The first tumbleweed I ever saw in my life. The only thing I've seen now as a tumbleweed is the plastic bags. And I call them Oklahoma tumbleweeds now. But this kind of what they were looking at, they were just tumbleweeds. It's kind of hard to build something out of that, but again, God had provided this when they left Egypt. He said, take this material with you. Whatever you want, you get. Well, I might want to build me a house when we're out there somewhere, get away from Egypt. I'll just take some lumber. Well, guess what the lumber was used for? Used for the tabernacle. So he asked them to bring all this stuff, to give us the materials and that they've accumulated on their trip out of Egypt. And what happens? Y'all know, don't you? It brought too much. Moses commanded them to stop. Wouldn't it be nice on a Sunday morning if I got up and said, hey, we're going to skip communion today because you guys already give too much. Or not communion, but contribution. So you gave too much, so just keep your money this week. I think probably half of us would faint if that happened. So what? Keep my money? I'm not supposed to give anything? I got this $1 here that it's burning a hole in my pocket. But he told them the people gave too much. Exodus 36, 5 through 7. And he says, stop, don't bring any more. We've got more than we need to make what God has given us on his blueprint. So the tabernacle was built then in 1 year by the children of Israel under the supervision of Moses. They mentioned a couple of contractors. I didn't put them in here because I can't pronounce their names. They were artisans, if you would, of the Hebrews, because these processes that they were building in the tabernacle required a lot of not just construction but artist work. They had to make, for instance, in the holies of holies, the cherubim were to be made out of one piece of gold. Just one piece. Well, you had to make something that was designed like a cherubim with their influence and inspiration of God, but out of one piece. You couldn't, it's kind of like, you ever seen the guys at Silver Dollar City or wherever that make the carvings out of a log and take a chainsaw and make a bear out of what looked like a log? Well, that's what these guys were doing with a chunk of gold. They were making cherubims. That's just one spot, and they had to make all the hooks and all the tools that they would use in the sacrifice and the transporting of the coals into the table of tabernacle of incense that they had next to the Holy of Holies. All these things required artwork, and we're going to look at some of the examples as we go through this thing that people have constructed here to kind of give us an idea of maybe what it looked like. So nothing that we've got, like I said, there was no Polaroids around at that time that could take any pictures. But he does give us a pretty good description, so you can take it from there and go. So it took them 1 year under the supervision of Moses, and they dedicated the tabernacle about 1450 BC. So just about 1,500 years almost before Jesus came. They had 1,500 years to examine the tabernacle and to practice those religious processes that God gave them. All in the shadow of the Messiah. All in the shadow of Christianity. All preparing for us, in a sense, because we can go back and see where it all connects. They didn't know who Jesus Christ was. They didn't realize that Jesus Christ was represented in everything that they did, in the religious ceremonies and in their tabernacle. So they built the dwelling. Go, baby. There it is. So there's another version of the tabernacle, by the way. It was portable, which it was intended to be. They were wandering. They were moving through the desert. So it had to be portable, but it was also the centerpiece of the camp. When they stopped traveling, they would set up around it, and they had a certain order even there as to how they're going to set up, and we're going to look at that when we talk about the Hebrews. So everything that was involved with the tabernacle was involved down to the letter, to the jot and the tittle that it was ready for. And when it was time to move, of course, they looked, and moved the whole thing following the cloud. And we're going to see that in just a moment. But it was their venue of worship. This was their church, if you would. There we go, Old Testament tabernacle again. It was built so that it could be a dwelling place. That's what God said. I'm going to build this. I want you to build this so I have a place that I can come and show that my presence is with you. Now, could God come in here and set, the God of the universe is bigger than the universe? I don't think he actually sat there, but I think his part of his spirit sat there. Enough visible spirit to know that God was around, that he was aware, that he knew they were there, to show his presence. They could look at any time and see either a cloud over the tabernacle. Let's see if I got it here. Yeah, there it is. I thought that was an interesting cloud. It looks like a face. So they could see God in this cloud over the tabernacle. in the daytime. And then at night, they would see a pillar of fire. And Israel's didn't move until the cloud was lifted and moved. Then they would follow that cloud wherever it led. And there's the pillar of fire for at night. So at night they had light. At least it wasn't totally dark when they were out there. And if you've ever been in the desert at night, it's dark. It's really dark. And it doesn't take a lot of light to make you feel a little bit better. But in this case, there was this pillar of fire that dwelt over that tabernacle for them to look at each and every night. So it was a camping place for God. If we think about us camping today in tents and all that stuff, well, that's what God did. He was in that camping spot. I remember as a kid, when I think about the tabernacle, I think about that our tent that my dad bought, and it was I think the canvas was about that thick. It must have weighed 200 pounds. We have to drag it out, and you couldn't pick it up. You just drug it out where you were going to set it up. And then we had a big box that weighed about another 300 pounds of tent pegs. And we'd get out there and we'd hammer those tent pegs in. It only took about 2-3 hours to set up your tent. And then we'd get in it and it'd start to rain, and if you touched it, wherever you touched it, it would leak. So so God decided, how for them to fix this tent that he was in. It didn't leak because it had 5-6 layers over the top of it. And again, we'll go into that in some of our next lessons. How am I doing? I'm getting pretty close. I think we might close a little bit early today, but that'll be okay with you, I'm sure. But, there's the first bill. So God appeared by the cloud in the daytime and by fire at night. And for 40 years, he dwells in the desert with them in spite of their sinfulness. And I think that's important for us to remember. Even though they were sinful, and God says, I can't dwell among sinful people. He never left them. In spite of their disobedience, he never left them. He was there. So symbolically, when we think about it, God will never leave us, regardless. He's there and will always be there. We may not deserve it, but he's there. Again, we don't have to bring in a goat or a sheep or an ox or 2 doves. We don't have to bring grain offerings. We don't have to bring all those things that they had to do. But we have a personal, thanks to Jesus Christ, a personal contact with God Almighty. And that, again, I've said it so many times, we ought to be the happiest people on earth. Because God dwells within us. And that's a tremendous blessing. So with that, next week, in the Tabernacle Biography, we'll be talking about God saying, get ready. We're going to get a closer look at their evacuation, if you would, from Egypt, their escape from slavery. And that comes up next Sunday morning. It'll be in the auditorium in the fellowship hall next week. If you want to come to that, you're very welcome. I'd like to see you. If you would rather stay with Marty's class in the auditorium, that's okay too. So God bless, and we'll see you next week.